Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on energizing your volunteers with a multi-generational engagement strategy. My name is Vicki Radcliffe, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started with our presentation, please bear with me as I review a few general reminders and instructions for our audience. If you're experiencing any issues getting online for our presentation, please call the Integrated Healthcare Strategies front desk. They may be able to assist you. That number you can call is 612-339-0919, again, 612-339-0919. Note that there are two ways to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can dial in directly to 1-866-809-9263 and use participant code 610-285-8791. You can also do that information up on your screen right now. Or you can have the system call you by clicking on the voice and video menu box and then clicking on the Join Audio button. You'll be prompted to type in your phone number, and then the computer will call you. Please be aware that all participant lines are muted for the entire presentation in order to reduce noise and distractions heard on the line. If you accidentally do unmute your line, please be sure to hit star 6 right now, that's star 6, to remute your own line. We do want to make sure that all participant lines are muted so as to not cause any noise or disruptions for our other guests. At the end of the presentation, we will allow time for questions and answers. If you have a question you would like addressed, you may type it in and we will read it out for our presenters and they can answer for you. To do so, please click on the Q&A button on the menu bar at the top of your screen. Type in your question and click on the Submit button, and we will do our best to make sure we get to it. At the close of our webinar, we will display contact information for our presenters, and if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can contact one of them directly with your request, and they will make sure you get a copy of the presentation. Our presenters today are David Rowlee, PhD. David is a Senior Vice President with Integrated Healthcare Strategy and leads our Engagement Survey Research Service line. We also have Kathy Beabout. Kathy is a Senior Survey Analyst with our firm, also working in our Engagement Survey Division. Now that I've got ahead and introduced them, I'll pass the baton to our presenters and let them dive in.
Okay, thank you, Vicki. I'm David Rowlee, and we're going to be diving into a lot of issues dealing with volunteer programs. And we're very excited to be here today, and we're going to talk just very briefly about our firm, Integrated Healthcare Strategies, a quick overview of what it is that we do as an organization, and then we'll quickly dive into all things around volunteer research. Just to give you a very brief overview of our history, we were founded in 1958, and we're a full-service consulting firm exclusively dedicated to healthcare. We offer a wide array of different services for our clients, including engagement surveys, but also look at things such as compensation, governance, and we also provide executive search solutions. At this point, our practices work very collaboratively to serve about 1,800 hospitals. And this gives you a quick understanding. I won't go through all of these, of course, but this will give you a quick understanding of the diversity of our practices and the different services that are provided. As a full-service consulting firm with multiple practices, we have obviously come to realize that there are a lot of very key stakeholder groups in healthcare organizations today. And in fact, the model that you're seeing now really conveys the understanding that, you know, in order to maximize business performance in healthcare, we have to have high levels of engagement across multiple stakeholder groups. I think traditionally a lot of consulting firms tended to look primarily at how employees behave, but we're starting to see the very powerful reasoning behind including groups such as volunteers and physician engagement, board and trustee engagement, and even the way that patients engage with your organization and return to your organization for services. So there's a variety of very compelling reasons to include all of these groups when we start to think about ways that a healthcare organization can really maximize its business performance. But of course today, we are primarily focused on where do the volunteers really fit into this equation? What is the return on investment for building a very sound a highly engaged group of volunteers that can really serve the organization and the patients that you serve as healthcare organizations today. We are very proud of the fact that we now work with many organizations to measure and assess volunteer engagement and really assess the attitudes that volunteers maintain more broadly about the healthcare system. This will give you an idea of some of our clients that we're currently working with. I've really pulled just a sample here to convey the depth and breadth of our database. You can see here that I've kind of sorted them for your ease into integrated systems, academic and children, as well as community and critical access standalone hospitals. And we're very proud of the fact that we have a chance and a great opportunity to work with many of the nation's leading healthcare organizations. You can see over here just a sample of our Baldrige organizations, our honor roll organizations, as well as many, many magnet designated organizations that we've worked with for some time now. So, you know, I think the best place to kind of start is, why is it that we are so focused on understanding volunteerism today for healthcare? As healthcare leaders that manage large populations of volunteers, I think it's fair to say that you're likely to be one of the folks in the organization that manages or leads the largest department or team in the organization. Oftentimes volunteer services have the most or the most folks associated with them. So you are true leaders of many people, and you know, things are changing in the volunteer landscape, particularly within healthcare. Some interesting research is out there and suggesting that, you know, this may be one of the most dynamic populations in healthcare today. We know, for example, that volunteer populations are aging, and it tends to be the case that we have very young volunteers that often come in to replace older volunteers that are kind of making their way out of the volunteering service that they've given your organizations. One of the interesting factors about that, and Kathy will get into some specific information around generation groups here, but if we really kind of consider the fact that younger volunteers are coming in and replacing volunteers, this brings a whole new set of expectations around what it means to volunteer. Specifically, the research cites that, you know, the days of long-term volunteer commitments and expectations among volunteers to be associated in a volunteer role for long periods of time are declining. And the popularity of a preference for shorter time commitments is on a rapid rise among volunteers. Another interesting thing is that, you know, with younger volunteers comes a shift toward a more highly educated and skilled volunteer population, really than ever before in the history of the volunteer world. And with that, of course, brings different types of goals and reasons why people may choose to volunteer. And again, you're going to see quite a bit to do about the reasons for volunteering nowadays. And it also brings a desire for more challenge and diversity in terms of the experiences that volunteers can collect while they're volunteering for your organization. So you can see that, you know, not only do you manage many, many people who really are donating their time for free and not really bonded to your organization in any particular way. They have the freedom to leave, so you have your work cut out for you to make sure that they have highly satisfactory experiences and want to stay, but you're also dealing with many, many trends that are going to add a lot more volatility into this whole notion of managing a volunteer population. So one of the first things I think is always good to do is define who it is that we're talking about. And as volunteer leaders, I'm sure you all understand what a volunteer is, but one of the interesting facts about really looking up a definition of volunteering is that, you know, in the early dictionaries, you know, from the 1800s and early 1900s, they tended to focus more on volunteering as, you know, selfless giving of time to help others. And it wasn't until more recent definitions of volunteering were released that we start to see this inclusion in the definition of, you know, it's not just about you helping other people, but there's always this second component now of what's in it for me? What am I going to get as a volunteer in exchange? And it's not money, of course, but it's how will this volunteering actually benefit me to enrich my life? And so we see that both in non-academic and academic definitions, there's always a balance of true altruism, giving of oneself to help others, but it's always counterbalanced with what am I going to get out of it? How is this going to benefit me? So it really isn't this pure selfless exchange anymore. It is always kind of a two-way street there. So I thought this was kind of interesting, and quite frankly, a lot of academics do as well. Academics have always struggled with this notion of, is it really in human nature to just absolutely unselfishly give and expect nothing in return? And a lot of academics, come to find out, have made long careers on investigating what compels people to really volunteer. How could this be possible that somebody would really want to give time and expect nothing in return? So a lot of literature is out there, and there's one theory in particular that's been widely embraced by folks that study volunteering, and it's a theory that we found particularly compelling, and I want to share that with you today. This particular theory is referred to broadly as the functionalist theory of volunteering. And the interesting thing about this theory is, again, it's very widely accepted, and it's, across testing of this theory, it always tends to be the case that it is confirmed time and time again. The interesting thing is that there are 6 primary reasons that this theory identifies why individuals choose to engage in volunteering. Now, of the 6 reasons, only the first one here referred to as values and generally defined as helping others in need. Of all the reasons why people volunteer, this is the only reason cited as truly something that means you're donating your time and efforts and energy to help others and expecting nothing in return. It's truly to help others in need. And so this would be something that we might refer to as enrichment of other people through your actions. Now, if we look at a balance of these reasons, 2 through 6, we see that there are a lot of reasons why people volunteer that really could be considered, won't say selfish here, but certainly enriching oneself through volunteering. And I want to spend just a moment on this. There are 2, you could further break down these reasons that I've highlighted here, 2 through 6, into a couple of different categories. I think it's probably fair to say that we have clear distinctions here between what we might consider professional development, that is, understanding, enhancement, and career in particular, where, these would be reasons for volunteering that really would help someone gain business experience, business acumen, sharpen their skills, potentially to lead to paid work or to enhance their career opportunities at some future time. The 5th and 6th reasons cited there, social and protective, are really more around personal development. That would be where folks are trying to kind of enrich their relations with other people. And so you really get a sense that, within this theory anyway, that the bulk of reasons are enriching oneself as opposed to helping others, and that we have a couple of different aspects of why people, or how people are enriching their self. Now, at this point, and Kathy and I we really like this theory, and we kind of fought over who got to present everything, so we ended up deciding that we would just split this section up. So Kathy is going to talk a little bit about how this theory is really used in terms of assessing volunteer efforts, and really talk about some of the general tendencies in terms of which reasons are chosen by which people. Okay, so Kathy, I'll turn this over to you.
Thanks, Dave. Now, as Dave mentioned, we definitely see that there are these 6 different reasons that people volunteer, but it is not the case that one person falls into one category. In fact, 2 out of 3 volunteers are going to give multiple reasons for volunteering, and most of them are going to say that helping others is one of their primary reasons. But their other reasons are going to vary depending on the personal circumstances of that volunteer. You know, they might be career motivated, they might have motivators that have to do with enhancing their relationships with other people, but it is going to differ based on that particular volunteer. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at an example of this. So we have this individual who's interested in volunteering because she wants to help others, and she has a lot of different opportunities available for her on where she can go to do this volunteer work. Now, she also, though, wants to develop an understanding of a certain industry and perhaps do some networking. Now, if that's the case, she's going to choose volunteer opportunity C because that's going to be the most likely to fit with her goal. Now, if in opportunity C, she is in fact able to gain an understanding of the industry and possibly further her career while feeling like she's contributing, you know, she's more likely to continue her volunteer service. Now, on the other hand, if that's not the case and she's not meeting her goals, she's far more likely to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate her different volunteer opportunities. Now, an interesting study recently, researchers placed volunteers into one of each of those categories of primary motivators and then asked them to rate which of the opportunities presented were most appealing to them and which were least appealing. And this chart kind of goes through and shows you, based on each of those primary motivators, which opportunities they liked the most and the least. Now, when we look at this, we see for a lot of these groups, reading to the blind was considered very important. And who's not going to say that reading to the blind is definitely a worthwhile activity? Well, as it turns out, this career-minded individual did not think that reading to the blind was a particularly good use of their time. And in fact, we didn't really want to clutter up the chart with this, but reading to the blind was very nearly tied as the absolute least important career-minded individual. It was second only to holiday baskets and not by very much at all. So, you can see that if you don't have options for your volunteers that appeal to those different types, you may be missing out on something. The more we can provide opportunities that appeal to individuals, the more engaged they're going to be in the organization. So now let's talk a little bit about engagement and why it's important and why we want to focus on it. For a long time, satisfaction has been the primary thing that people are interested in measuring, especially when it comes to employee satisfaction. But over the past several years, there's been a shift to measuring engagement. And the reason for that is that engagement is a much more robust predictor of whether or not someone plans to stay with the organization, how hard they plan to work, whether or not they would recommend it to others. And the same is really true for volunteers as it is for employees. When it comes to volunteer engagement, an engaged volunteer is going to provide more effort, they're going to be more proud of their service, they're going to have a feeling of accomplishment, and they're going to help the organization pursue its goals while they pursue their own. Now, when it comes to volunteer engagement, we have identified 4 items that we have found that are really going to be the most predictive of whether or not a volunteer is engaged, and those focus on those items that I mentioned earlier: effort, pride, a sense of accomplishment, and whether or not they're aligned with goals. Now, when we look in our national database at the difference between 2011 and 2012, volunteer engagement has actually declined. And I know that the difference between 5.74 and 5.70 is not a huge decline, but when you're looking at thousands of volunteers, it is a statistically significant decline. So the question then is, what caused this shift? Well, we've broken out volunteers based on a response pattern. And we can see that there are 3 distinct groups of volunteers. The ones with the very highest levels of scores on those 4 items are who we consider to be engaged volunteers. As you can see, they are very nearly at the top of our scale. In contrast to that, we also have a group that is definitely lower than that. And then that's the group we consider disconnected. They're most likely on their way out the door. And then there's this group in the middle that is disengaging. And as you can see, there's definitely a strong decline in whether or not the volunteer feels like they're making an impact to the organization. Now, one of the things to really look at in this is that from 2011 to 2012, all of these groups are moving in a direction opposite of what we would want to see. The engaged population is down, the disengaging population is up, and the disconnected population is definitely up. And in fact, the disconnected population has tripled in size. So it's definitely something that we need to be aware of, because you don't, as a volunteer leader, you don't have those same ties that bind your workforce to the organization the way an employee does. You know, an employee manager is going to have pay and benefits and, you know, potential career growth, all of that tying the employee to the organization. But you as a volunteer leader don't have that. So it's really imperative that if you want to keep your volunteer workforce engaged, you know, it's up to you as a leader to really kind of step up the game. And the question really is, what can we do to turn around this trend that we're seeing? So, and as I mentioned earlier, because you don't have those same ties, you know, you also can't control every aspect of why volunteers stay early. There are some things that are just going to be outside of the realm that you have influence over. But we've identified 5 areas that volunteer leaders do have an influence over. Oops, went back. And we've created this engagement module, which really kind of incorporates those 5 areas, and this is what we use to do our national survey. Now, from that survey, we've done what is called a key driver analysis, and this key driver analysis is based on an advanced statistics procedure called regression analysis, and it's going to determine the survey items that we have that are most predictive of volunteer engagement. And then it also ranks and prioritizes these drivers based on how much of an impact they actually have on volunteer engagement. If you're working with another firm, it's possible that you might have heard of correlation analysis, and that is fairly common in the industry, but correlation analysis really only confirms that a relationship exists. The regression model is far more predictive of whether or not changing in one thing will actually influence volunteer engagement. So when we look at the key drivers of volunteer engagement, these are all rated based on the order of influence that they have on volunteer engagement. And that first driver, understanding how volunteering contributes to the organization's mission and goals, that really falls in line with the values motivation that we talked about earlier, and it kind of helps us explain the decline that we saw in whether or not volunteers feel like they are making an impact on the organization. Now, factors 2 through 8, these are more of a hodgepodge based on the specific circumstances of the volunteer. You can kind of see that they definitely fall into those other reasons people volunteer, like understanding, career, social, protective, enhancement. You know, you see a little of that in each of these. Now, when we looked at that previous analysis that broke out the 3 different groups of volunteers, we definitely saw an interesting pattern in that a large portion of the disconnected volunteers were Generation Y. So what's really going on with Generation Y? Well, as it turns out, Generation Y, which are volunteers between the ages of 16 and 35, they're actually 4 times more likely to be disconnected than their older counterparts. In fact, they're also even 3 times more likely to be disconnected than they were even a year ago. And the portion of Generation Y that was engaged fell nearly 20% during the last 12 months. So, I mean, that's a lot going on with Generation Y. So we can look and see what's causing this with that key drivers analysis. Well, when it comes to Generation Y, there were really 7 items that came out as very predictive for Generation Y volunteer engagement. And number 1 was that same one that flows throughout volunteers, and it's good for us to see that because it gives us something that we can work on regardless of the generation. However, the remaining factors, it really looks like we see volunteers wanting to develop in the business world. When we look at how these items are trending compared to the national benchmark, though, it's not good. In particular, these items that just showed up in yellow are significantly negative to our national benchmark. And what's even more interesting about this is that these are textbook Generation Y characteristics. They are achievement-oriented, they're team-oriented, and they're attention-craving. They want feedback and guidance. They want to work with other people, and they have really high expectations. Now, as a Generation Y individual myself, I can tell you, all the things that you hear about Generation Y, they're true. You can't give us enough feedback. We want to be challenged. We definitely want to be able to showcase our skills. In contrast, when we look at traditionalists, and those are going to be volunteers that are over 67 years old, their drivers are much more in line with the social and protective motivators that we saw earlier. And when we look at how that trends compared to our national benchmark, we're definitely doing a good job catering to our traditionalist volunteers. So that gives you a little bit of insight into how things are trending with the national and different things that you can do for your volunteers to really help them become more engaged. But I'm going to turn it over to Dave now so that he can provide a bit more insight onto why it's important for volunteers to be engaged.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. I think that provided some excellent information in terms of, making the point that different strategies are needed to engage different volunteer groups depending on, in this case, age. We see that, obviously some striking differences in terms of what's going to most enthuse volunteers based on their generation group. Now, one of the questions is always, so what is the return on investment for building a volunteer program? And, it's relatively uncommon for leaders of volunteer services to actually have a seat at the senior, on the senior executive team and that sort of thing. And the more we dig into the actual impact of volunteers, the more we think that should change. We are seeing more and more evidence that volunteer groups are making a tremendous impact in terms of not only just basic things, and I shouldn't say basic because complex things like improving patient satisfaction, but even larger bottom line goals like profitability and profit margin, for example, of healthcare systems. So I really want to start this section out with a quote that was provided by one of our clients, Julie Vandernoot, and I think she states this very well. She talks about the survey sending a powerful message to folks across the organization that they are a key part of the healthcare team. Volunteers are a key part. And best of all, we can measure our value empirically. And this is a very powerful statement because what I'm about to share with you is a lot of statistics, but hopefully summarized in a really straightforward way that's going to offer some great insights into the power of engaging volunteers. So let's begin with this model. You've seen a couple of variations of this model through the presentation, and I want to talk a little bit about this notion of linkage modeling. And this is where we really look at different populations and kind of show and confirm empirically how the behavior in one group or one population actually produce results in another or stimulate behaviors in another population. So in this case today, what we're going to look at is what do engaged volunteer populations actually do to patients and subsequently to business performance. And likewise, what do disengaged volunteers do to patients and business performance? So we're going to start out with just kind of a basic model here, and you may have all seen this before in intro business classes. This is a model that was released in the early 90s, and it was a study done in a retail environment, and it's referred to as the service profit chain model. And the service profit chain model has evolved over the years and become a little bit more complex, but still a relatively straightforward model, which basically suggests that in order to be profitable and experience all sorts of business excellence, we really need to have engaged customers. And the model then says that in order to get engaged customers, we really have to have engaged employees. Now, this model has kind of moved through, evolved over time. It really began with satisfaction, but as you know, the focus tends to be on engagement these days. So the model has kind of evolved and been relabeled over time. Since its introduction, researchers have established that, profitability and growth in an organization doesn't necessarily always come through how customers or patients feel about you. Rather, employees, for example, can do things, can introduce process efficiencies, can, as Kathy mentioned around the whole notion of engagement, work harder to produce better results and so on. So there's a lot of direct impact that employees have directly to business outcomes. And, then some further evolution of the model took place, and it was realized that, hey, when an organization is highly profitable and chooses to reinvest some of that profit back into its employees and customers, there's a return there as well. So this is really how the model typically is presented in the current literature. Now, at IH Strategies, what we really, again, focus on exclusively is healthcare environments, and we've realized that this model has a lot of value when adapted or modeled using healthcare data, but we've really found that the model needs to really add in some of those other key stakeholder groups that we believe are critically important to the operational efficiency of any health system. And that would be engaged physicians as well as engaged employees, but also engaged volunteers. And I promised you at the beginning of the segment that the focus would really be on what is it that engaged volunteers can do in terms of engaging patients and having business success. So we've really mined our national database and a lot of financial metrics and so on of organizations that we work with, and we've kind of brought this service profit chain model to life through our own database. And what we're really seeing here, if we kind of focus on volunteer engagement for a moment, is that we've got a couple of different types of volunteers. To make it as streamlined as possible, let's consider that we have some volunteers that are significantly below average in terms of engagement, and we have another group that's significantly above average in terms of their engagement. So let's handle the below average group first. So if we run below average volunteers through here in terms of their engagement, we can empirically associate them with organizations that experience patient satisfaction metrics that look like this. Only slightly over half of below average engagement volunteer populations, only slightly over half of patients that are being cared for in environments that have below average engaged volunteers are able to rate their care experience a 9 or a 10. Likewise, just over half of patients would recommend the organization for care to others when they're receiving care in environments that are staffed by below average engaged volunteers. Now, what does this mean for business success? Well, these organizations are associated with negative profit margins, okay? Not so good. Now, if we turn to what happens in environments that have highly engaged volunteers, here's the picture that we get. We get a 17% increase in terms of the proportion of patients that are able to rate their care experience a 9 or a 10. We get a 23% increased proportion of patients rating or likely to recommend this particular healthcare facility to others for their care needs. And look what happens to profit margin. We go from a negative profit margin to a 5.2% operating margin, which is actually double the current observed rate of healthcare in the United States, for example, today. Okay, so just a remarkable linkage when we look at environments that have highly engaged volunteers versus environments that have less engaged volunteers. Now, I want to show you something which you're not going to be able to see very well, okay, because of the size. But that's the whole impact of this particular slide, is that there's a lot going on here. Now, I want you to think about something. In the world of customer satisfaction research, there is a push for organizations to really think critically about the way they serve their customers. So a lot of organizations are embarking down this route of producing something called a customer journey map. Now, what you see here, you see a line through the center of this particular chart here, and right above it we see anticipate, enter, engage, exit, reflect, and so on. Below that line is a series of statements which really are possible touch points that an organization can have with a customer or, let's say, a patient that would make them feel good about their anticipation, their entrance, their engagement, and so on. Now, let me tell you something that's kind of mind-boggling here. That's a lot of things, first of all, for an organization to think about when it comes to pleasing a customer. Okay, I think we all agree on that. Now, the mind-blowing thing is this is someone ordering a cup of coffee. Okay? We're not talking about receiving care. This is literally the customer journey map for someone that walks into a coffee shop, orders a single cup of coffee, and leaves. Now, can you imagine the volume of critical touch points that a healthcare organization has when, performing surgery on a patient in an inpatient scenario or an emergency room visit? Imagine how many opportunities there are to interact with that patient and ensure that they have a satisfactory experience. That's the whole point of this next slide that I'm about to show you. If we go back to this service profit chain for a moment and consider not only the touch points that volunteers can have with patients, but the amount of savings to a healthcare organization that properly trains and prepares volunteers to manage many of these touch points, imagine the return on investment, that link that goes directly from volunteer engagement to business success. It must be remarkable. Well, some researchers studied this a few years back. Now think about this. This is a few years back, so it's likely that we would see even increases in terms of the return on investment. But in this particular study, which happens to be conducted on 31 hospitals in the Toronto area, okay, we may make an argument here that hospitals in the United States may even get a higher level of return on investment. But look at what the finding was. For every dollar invested to recruit, train, and manage volunteers, hospitals were deriving an average of $6.84 in value from the volunteers. Now, when I say a seat at the executive table for volunteer leaders, this is what I'm talking about. You are leading groups of individuals that potentially have nearly a 700% return on the investment that the hospital is making in the volunteer programs. This is a remarkable finding. In fact, I have to tell you, this is one of the first academic articles that I've ever read where I saw an exclamation point after this particular sentence in the article. Okay, so a pretty compelling finding indeed. So what we want to do here is really wrap this up with some concluding remarks. I want to present to you a concise list of takeaways that I want everyone, if you're going to print one slide from this entire presentation, this would be the slide really to print. This is what we hope we've really tried to convey and what we hope we have conveyed. Volunteers really do volunteer to enrich the lives of others. We have these definitions that have that altruistic side combined with these self-serving sides. And, quite frankly, there are a lot of pessimistic researchers out there that really don't think too much of anyone really volunteering to help others, but they think they're more purely self-serving. And our research, through thousands of volunteers working across many, many organizations, really confirms that primarily the thing that's on top of mind for volunteers is, trying to volunteer to contribute to the organization's mission and goals. They really are in it for the benefit of others. So that was a very comforting finding, and I think it's something that we can be very proud of as healthcare leaders and so on. But, nevertheless, we did confirm that there are other reasons why people choose to volunteer. And furthermore, those reasons differ drastically based on age, or I'll tell you other demographic characteristics of volunteers. Doesn't necessarily have to be focused on generation group. The whole point here is that managing a volunteer group who is arguably, from an age perspective, more diverse than many other departments or divisions throughout an organization is very challenging. There are a lot of moving parts, and there are a lot of complexities in terms of understanding the things that are going to make those folks engaged. What it boils down to is that volunteer engagement just simply hinges on the ability to make sure that people are able to accomplish what it is that they want to accomplish through their volunteer experience. You need to understand that as organizations and ensure that you're aligning folks with things that highly interest them. As Kathy shared that table with you early on, there were a number of tasks, and some people felt certain things were important and others felt other things weren't important. And it doesn't mean that they're bad volunteers if they don't want to read to the blind, for example. All it means is that you have to find what it is that they're best at and think about it from that return on investment standpoint. Things that people are best at and feel most challenged and compelled to engage in are the things that they're going to do most efficiently and best and potentially improve drastically for you as a volunteer. To ensure a high return on investment of your volunteer program, it's essential that you understand specifically what you need to do as an organization to engage your volunteers. What we showed you was a modeling of our national database, and you saw a list of 10 items that would promote engagement across the healthcare landscape. Now, what this means is that those things may indeed be good for your organization, but the other thing to understand is that, you as individual, unique organizations may have slightly different drivers, and in some cases these drivers may switch positions in terms of what did you most prioritize to work on. So it's important that each of you really get a handle on what's driving engagement in your organizations, study those things, and implement action planning that will help, lead those things to a more positive state. The other thing, obviously, here is, this whole notion of the linkage analysis, looking at different stakeholder groups and understanding in combination how these groups actually impact one another and particularly impact the patient experience. The end goal is quality care, okay, and another goal is patient satisfaction. And you simply, I'm telling you, it is simply impossible to maximize those initiatives unless everyone is on board, and that means the inclusion of volunteers in any kind of measurement effort or any kind of exploration of how human capital is helping your organization advance in the right direction. Volunteers are essential. So at this point, we'd like to open it up to questions. We still have about 15 minutes, which is great. That's exactly where we want it to be. And, you know, Kathy and I always like to make a contest out of anything we can. So you are welcome to email or phone either one of us if you would like to do a number of things. Certainly, we encourage you to request a copy of the presentation today, and we will be creating a sound file as well that can be distributed out in case you'd like to hear the recorded version along with our slides. But also, we just like to extend an offer for you to call and discuss the ways that you measure volunteer engagement and talk a little bit more about your volunteer programs. I mean, we love this. We've done a webinar on it, and we've been focused on researching it for some time. So we would love to hear your stories, understand what you're doing, and it always helps us build more insight. And, you know, maybe we have some things that we can share with you as well to help enrich the volunteer experience in your organization. So, you know, I'll say thank you for attending, but we're very happy to field questions here in the time we have remaining.
I want to thank one organization in particular that signed up, because one of the volunteer leaders that is on the call today is actually from an organization that I volunteered at in high school, so that is very exciting for me.
90 people. That is a really funny coincidence, Kathy. Thank you. Thank you to both Dave and Kathy for that really very interesting information and statistics on our healthcare volunteers. I think that all our participants, it's safe to say, are going to walk away with a lot of valuable information. As David noted, that is the conclusion of our presentation portion, but stay with us as we move into the Q&A session now. Before I move to the first question of the ones that have come in so far, I'm going to give you a quick reminder on how you can ask a question if you'd like to. You simply go to the Q&A button on the menu bar at the top of your screen, type in and submit your question, and that's all you have to do. That said, I'll go to our first question here, and please bear with me as I work with our system to pull that up. Okay, the table that showed the career-minded volunteers not being too interested in helping people, I believe reading to the blind was very low importance. Is this a good idea to have someone like this in a healthcare setting? David or Kathy, could you take that question for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And the real answer is, of course, it is important to have this person in a healthcare setting. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the more diversity you have within your volunteer population, the more you are going to be able to utilize those skills. So if you've got somebody who's not necessarily interested in reading blind, you know, you can definitely utilize their skills in other areas, perhaps as an assistant to a department or something like that. So, I mean, it's actually a benefit for you to have have individuals at your organization that do have different motivators.
Okay.
Do you have anything to add, David?
No, I think Kathy framed it up well. You know, it's just all about you know, the fact that there are many different tasks and responsibilities that can be distributed to volunteers, and you know, it really is a matter of just finding and understanding which volunteers are best aligned with that. It's kind of like, you know, the realistic job preview for an employee. We just need to better understand, you know, what that best task or set of tasks is to assign to each individual, you know, volunteer. So
yeah, the more options we give them, the better engaged they're going to be.
Okay. Well, we've got a couple of questions coming in here. Okay, here's another one. Vicki, do you want me to read these or?
I can go ahead and read them off. I have a question from Tanya here that says, we are interested in how Kathy surveyed the volunteers' level of engagement.
Well, that's a great question, Tanya. We actually, since this is part of our national survey, we do offer this service to clients and contract with us to do this. In particular, we use 4 items to specifically measure volunteer engagement. One of them is I am able to make an impact on this organization through my volunteer assignments. The other is I am proud to volunteer for this organization. The third is I would recommend volunteering at this organization to my friends and family. And the fourth is volunteering gives me a feeling of personal accomplishment. And those are really the 4 things that we use to define volunteer engagement and show how engaged volunteers are. And we do that in the context of a larger survey of volunteers so that we can get a feel for what's really driving those 4 items. And we can do this survey either online or via paper. We can also conduct it in multiple languages if that is necessary. So, we definitely encourage you to contact us if you're interested in finding out more about this service that we offer.
Okay, thank you. And to ask our presenters here, we do have several questions that are coming in. I'm seeing a little overlap on some of them, and you folks know how to, kind of best answer and know what's kind of been covered already. So would you like to go ahead and review some of the questions and choose which ones are going to kind of be the best value to ask here with our time, or do you want me to continue to just tick through them?
Yeah, we have we have one that's actually a nice follow-up to the question that Kathy just fielded. The question is from Katie. How do you go about measuring the key drivers of your specific volunteer population? Well, Katie, the way that we did, obviously, Kathy just read to you those items that we use to measure engagement of volunteers. And the particular model then that we run on that is to look at all the other items in the survey and understand which of those items most influence positive responses to those engagement items. So that's how we do it with our database. So in terms of how you would go about doing it, you would essentially need to measure an array of different items, different workplace experiences that a volunteer might have, and then basically take the data and find someone that could do that statistical procedure with it. But the whole idea is that you're essentially correlating, what most corresponds to the answers to those engagement items. And so it's a bit of a statistical procedure, but that's how you would go about doing it. Well, there's another question about language capabilities, and that is based on us. Is our survey provided in multiple languages? And the answer to that is yes. We translate into basically any language that would be required. So there is a question about the reports. It says, do you have a sample or value-added report that could be used to make an impact on the senior leadership team? From a reporting standpoint, Kathy, do you want to talk a little bit about the overall report that we typically provide folks?
Well, when it comes to the volunteer survey, we definitely provide a report that kind of goes through and details for you how your organization compares next to the norm in these items that we've measured. But when it comes to kind of a value-added perspective that you can go to senior leadership with, I recommend that you take part of this presentation to them and say, look, we definitely have an impact. There's this research that says it, and, see if you can get a little bit more buy-in in that measure. Like Dave mentioned earlier, you can definitely contact us, and we will be happy to share the presentation with you. And then there's also going to be a recording up online if they're interested in viewing the webinar as well.
Hey, Vicki, any other questions that you'd like to?
I know that there's still probably quite a few questions that haven't been answered yet, but we are starting to run a little bit short on time. Vicki, do you know if we've got contact information, like email addresses, so we can get in touch with some of these others?
We do indeed, and you're right, we're getting close to kind of our end time. We want to be respectful of everybody's time that they took to spend with us, so we'll want to wrap up. We have a few other closing comments that I'd like to make, but yes, we do have all the questions logged here into the webinar system, so we'll be able to follow up with you. These particular contacts, we have email addresses, so we'll try to do our best to get your questions asked. If we didn't get to your question and you had one you wanted to ask, again, our presenters' contact information is up on your screen right now. Please feel free to contact them directly and have further discussions with them. So that said, I want to thank all our participants for making time to listen in today. And again, as we had noted before, if you want a copy of today's presentation or want to know how to get that, audio file, again, contact our presenters, Kathy or David, or, reach out to our firm directly, and we will make sure that you can receive a copy of that. Keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars, and we hope you'll join us again soon. Have a great day.